The stories. This hospital wing is a secret trap. Larkin Pruitt learned that phrase from a guard who would not step past the double doors, not even for overtime pay. The wing sat dark on the fourth floor, and people swore it was built to catch the wrong person. He was 34 years old and worked as a biomedical equipment tech at a regional hospital near a river town. That morning, he just wanted to swap old heart monitors, label cables, and go home before his shift ran long. The renovation schedule said the wing was closed, which meant no patients and fewer interruptions for once. The charge nurse handed him a clipboard and pointed at the service elevator with a tired look. "Fourth floor, east wing, and do not get cute with those doors," she said, keeping her voice low. Larkin asked what she meant, and she shook her head like she hated the story. "They lock weird, and that place eats radios," she said, then walked away before he could ask more. Security met him at the elevator with a plastic bin of temporary badges and 2 flashlights. The guard was named Terrence Hale, late 50s, and he moved like his knees hurt every step. Terrence scanned Larkin in, then stopped at the threshold and did not cross it. "If you hear the overhead chime, you walk back out," Terrence said, watching the ceiling instead of Larkin. Larkin tried to laugh, but it came out flat and unsure. He said he was not hunting ghosts, he was swapping monitors and checking batteries. Terrence nodded like he had heard that line too many times before. "Sure," Terrence said, then pointed to the stairwell door behind them. "That is your exit. Remember it." The east wing smelled like old disinfectant and dusty drywall, with a colder air that felt deliberate. Work lights hung from cords, but only 2 of them worked, and they threw long shadows. The hallway signs still named departments that no longer existed, like Respiratory Overflow and Recovery Annex. Larkin kept moving, because standing still made the quiet feel heavier than it should. He reached the supply alcove, where the monitors were stacked in a neat row, ready for removal. Each unit had a tag with a date, and the oldest one read 1997 in faded ink. He took out his phone to snap photos for his work log, then noticed his signal was gone. That fit what Terrence said, and it still made Larkin uneasy in a way he could not name. He started on the first monitor and kept his tools close, because he did not like the echo. Metal clicks bounced down the hall, then came back softer, like someone else was repeating them. He told himself it was just the building, just the empty rooms and the tile floors. Then the overhead speaker crackled, and a single tone chirped like a call bell clearing its throat. The sound lasted 2 seconds, then the speaker went quiet again. Larkin froze with a screwdriver in his hand, listening hard for anything that followed. Nothing happened, so he exhaled and forced himself to keep working. That was when the double doors behind him swung inward and shut with a heavy final thud. He turned and walked back fast, because he did not like the timing at all. The doors had no handle on his side, just a smooth plate and a narrow seam. He pushed anyway and felt the panel give a little, then lock solid like it hit a deadbolt. He called out Terrence's name, but his voice died in the hallway like the air swallowed it. Larkin stepped back and tried the crash bar on the nearby stairwell door. The bar did not move, and the red alarm light above it did not blink. He pulled his badge and waved it at the reader, and the reader stayed dark. That was the moment the phrase made sense, and his stomach tightened with a cold rush. He walked to the closest nurse station and found an old desk with a dead computer monitor. A dusty phone sat on the counter, and its receiver cord was cut cleanly. On the wall behind it, a laminated map showed routes marked with arrows and thick lines. Someone had written in pen across the bottom, "Do not use east exit during isolation." Larkin had heard stories about isolation wings during outbreaks, but this felt older than that. He followed the map, moving slow and checking each intersection for an open stairwell. Every door he tried was locked, and the badge readers were either blank or missing. The only thing that worked was the overhead speaker, which clicked again and gave one more chirp. He stopped near room 418 because the door was cracked open a few inches. Inside was a stripped patient room with an empty bed frame and a cracked plastic chair. The window blinds were half down, and the light from outside made the room look underwater. On the floor near the wall, a thin line of dust was disturbed, like something had been dragged recently. Larkin crouched and looked closer, and he saw scuff marks leading to the bathroom. The bathroom door was closed, but the handle was intact and it opened with a soft squeal. There was nothing inside except an old vent grate and a faint smell of damp drywall. Then he noticed the grate screws were new, shiny against the rust around them. He could have ignored it, but his instincts would not let him. He grabbed the grate and pulled, and it popped free like someone wanted it removed fast. Behind it was a narrow space, not a normal duct, more like a hidden passage between walls. A second vent cover sat a few feet in, and beyond that, he saw a faint glow. Larkin took out his flashlight and aimed it into the gap, then heard a low whir of a fan. The glow came from a small work light set on the floor, and it was still warm. Someone had been there, and not a long time ago. His skin prickled and he backed away, because he did not have any business crawling into a wall. He returned to the hallway and tried to call again, but his phone still showed no service. He turned on airplane mode and off again, then tried anyway, and it failed like before. He opened his work bag and found a small handheld tester with a recording function for troubleshooting. It was not meant for this, but it was better than nothing. So he pressed record and spoke clearly. He said his name, his job, the date, and that he was locked inside the East Wing. He described the speaker tones, the door shut, and the vent gap with a warm light inside. He did it the way he filed incident reports, calm and factual, even though his hands shook. When he finished, he clipped the tester to his belt like a tiny witness. Larkin walked back to the double doors and pounded 3 times, then waited. No footsteps came, no reply, and the air felt colder near the doors, like the building was breathing. He looked up and saw a small camera dome in the corner, its lens facing down the hall. The tiny green light on it was off, which meant it might not be recording at all. He remembered the map and the note about isolation, and he started thinking like a tech again. If this wing was built for quarantine, it could have negative pressure, sealed doors, and remote locks. That could explain the weird air and the dead signals if the walls were reinforced. It could also explain why Terrence would not cross the threshold, because nobody wanted to be locked inside. He needed a control panel, something that ran the doors and the fans. He followed the hall until he found a metal door marked with faded letters, "Facilities only." It was locked, but the hinge side had a gap where the frame did not meet right. He slid his flashlight beam along it and saw the corner of a keypad inside. He tried the door again and felt it flex, like the latch was old and tired. He took a flat tool from his kit and worked it into the gap carefully, pushing in small increments. After a minute, the latch slipped, and the door opened with a groan that echoed too far. Inside was a cramped room full of conduit, breaker boxes, and a panel with tiny labeled switches. The panel had a sticker that read, "Isolation System, installed 1999. Below it sat a thin binder in a cracked plastic sleeve, full of maintenance notes. Larkin flipped through and saw repeated entries about door faults, speaker tests, and lock cycling. One note was underlined twice and dated 2008, and it said, "Do not enable autoseal without supervisor." He kept turning pages and found an incident entry that made him stop breathing for a second. It said a contractor got trapped after a test, and dispatch logs showed a delayed response. The note used careful language, but it ended with, "Injury reported, claim filed." Larkin had never heard about any of that, and he worked here for years. He pulled out his phone and took photos of the binder pages, then remembered there was no service. He took them anyway, because proof mattered later, even if he could not send it now. He scanned the panel and found a switch labeled Seal Enable, and it was in the on position. Next to it was a smaller switch labeled Override Release, and it was covered with a taped plastic guard. The tape looked fresh, and the guard had tiny scratches like it had been forced back recently. Larkin peeled the tape carefully and lifted the guard, then flipped the override release down. A low alarm tone sounded, not loud, but sharp, and the fans slowed like they were winding down. Down the hall, he heard the double doors clunk like bolts retracting inside the frame. He ran back to the threshold and pushed, and this time the doors moved with stiff resistance. They opened just enough for him to squeeze through, and cool normal air hit his face. He did not feel relief yet, because the hallway behind him was still dark and still wrong. He stepped out fully, and the doors shut again behind him with a softer close. Terrence was gone from the security desk, and the service elevator stood open and empty. Larkin jogged to the main corridor and finally saw a nurse, then another, then a doctor. He waved them down and tried to explain, but his voice came out too fast. A supervisor told him to sit, drink water, and wait for security, and Larkin did not argue. Within minutes, a different guard arrived, younger, and his radio worked fine in the main hall. Larkin told him everything, and he handed over the recording from the tester without hesitation. He also showed the photos on his phone, even though they were just images in a dead zone. The guard frowned and said the East Wing should be sealed only during drills, and nobody scheduled any drills. Later that afternoon, the hospital risk manager pulled Larkin into a small conference room. She was named Maris Holt, early 40s, and she spoke like someone used to bad news. She asked him to repeat the timeline, then asked if he touched anything inside the wing. Larkin said he opened a facility's door and flipped an override, because he was trapped and had no other choice. Maris stared for a long moment, then nodded slowly like she had expected that answer. She said the isolation system was supposed to be decommissioned years ago, but the project never finished. She did not explain why, and she did not have to, because her eyes gave it away. Some parts of the hospital were left behind on paper, but still alive in the walls. The next day, Larkin came back with permission to gather his tools and finish his work. This time, 2 guards went with him, and one of them carried a portable repeater for radio signal. They logged every door, every switch, and every camera dome they could find. The repeater worked until they crossed the threshold. Then the signal died again like it hit a curtain. They followed Larkin to the facilities room, and the seal enable switch was on again. Maris was not there, but a facilities supervisor was, and his face went tight when he saw it. He said nobody on his team touched that panel, and he sounded scared saying it. The younger guard took photos and called for a detective from the city, because now it was not a glitch. The detective arrived with a notebook and a calm voice, and she asked for every record they had. She requested keycard logs for the service elevator, maintenance entries, and any camera footage near the 4th floor. She used careful phrases like reportedly and consistent with, as if she knew the hospital would fight itself. Larkin watched her write, and he felt a sick pride that his recording might matter. The keycard logs showed an odd detail. One badge had accessed the service elevator at dawn that day. The badge belonged to a contract cleaner, but witness statements said the cleaner never showed up. The hospital said badges were sometimes shared, which was a problem all by itself. The detective asked who had custody of spare badges, and security went quiet. They pulled older records too, because the binder note about 2008 would not leave Larkin's mind. Dispatch logs from that year showed a call from the East Wing, then a second call, then a response delay. The narrative report used soft language about confusion and locked doors, but the pattern felt familiar. Maris admitted the injury claim existed, and she said it was settled quietly to avoid panic. Then the detective found something that connected the vent gap to the locks in a way nobody liked. A building plan from archived facilities files showed a service crawl behind room 418. It linked to a small corridor that led toward the pharmacy level, not wide enough for comfort. The plan labeled it as a contamination bypass, built so supplies could move during isolation. On paper, it made sense, but the fresh screws and warm work light meant it was being used now. They sent a small camera probe into the gap, and its final footage showed drag marks and boot prints. Near the far end, the camera caught a plastic tote wedged behind a pipe, still sealed. Inside the tote were dozens of pre-packed syringe kits, the kind tracked tightly by the pharmacy. That discovery changed the tone of the whole investigation, because now there was a motive. Someone was using the old bypass to steal controlled supplies without crossing monitored hallways. The lock trap was not superstition. It was a tool, and it kept witnesses out of the way. If a tech got stuck inside, the thief could work the bypass with less risk of being seen. The twist came when they matched the Dawn badge swipe to a second system log. The isolation panel recorded every time the seal enable switch changed position. It showed the switch was turned on 2 minutes after the badge swipe, then turned off later. That meant the person who entered wanted the wing sealed, and they knew exactly where the panel was. They checked cameras outside the threshold because those still worked, and one angle finally gave a face. The figure wore scrubs under a jacket and kept their head down, but the gait was distinct. A nurse manager recognized the walk and the shoes, and she said it matched a long-time supply runner. The hospital could not accuse anyone publicly, but the detective did not need public accusations. A week later, the detective returned with a warrant and took a specific employee into custody off-site. The public statement said an internal theft ring was under investigation, and details were limited. Mara sent a short email to staff saying the East Wing was sealed permanently pending safety upgrades. No one wrote the words "secret trap" in that email, but everybody understood the message anyway. Larkin finished replacing the monitors in a different unit, and he refused any job that required the East Wing. He kept the tester recording backed up at home because he did not trust systems that went dark. Sometimes he still thought about that chirp from the overhead speaker, small and polite and wrong. It sounded like a warning or a signal, and he believed it had saved him by making him move. Months later, after the panel was removed and the bypass was filled, Terrence finally told Larkin one more thing. He said the wing was built to protect the rest of the hospital, and it did when used right. He said the danger came when someone decided protection could also be a cage. Larkin nodded and looked at the plain wall where the double doors used to be, and felt quiet relief. The stories. Why this bridge changed everything forever. The state report said the bridge failure was an accident, but the dispatch audio tells a different story. What happened on that span turned a quiet county into a place that never felt normal again. Tobin Rusk was 38, and he worked as a road inspector for a small transportation district. He drove a white pickup, carried a thick binder, and treated every complaint like it mattered. On a clear morning in late fall, he headed toward an old steel truss bridge outside a riverside town. The plan was simple. He would photograph rust spots and sign off on a routine maintenance note. The bridge was called Latham's Span on maps, though locals just called it the River Bridge. Tobin arrived before noon, and he noticed something that did not fit the usual pattern. Fresh orange cones sat near the north shoulder, but no crew truck was parked nearby. A hand-painted board leaned against the rail, and the warning looked rushed and uneven. It said, "Do not stop on bridge," and the letters were thick like they were done in panic. Tobin parked off the approach, and he walked the deck with his camera ready. Halfway across, he found a strip of new asphalt that cut straight across two lanes. It was not wide, but it was too clean, like someone patched a scar in the dark. He crouched near the patch, and he saw a faint line where the surface had been cut. Under the tar smell, there was another odor, sharp and metallic, like hot wiring insulation. Tobin took photos, then he pressed his knuckles to the asphalt to feel for warmth. It was cool, which meant the patch was not from last night like the cones suggested. A car passed behind him, and the driver slowed, then accelerated hard without looking. Tobin stood up, and he realized there were no pedestrians, no fishing gear, no stopped traffic. The bridge felt avoided, like the whole county agreed to keep moving. Back at his truck, Tobin opened his binder and reviewed the last inspection notes. The prior entry, dated 2 months earlier, mentioned only paint flaking and minor bolt corrosion. There was no note about any patch and no mention of cones, boards, or emergency repairs. He called the district office, and the receptionist said no work order was scheduled there. Tobin asked about unplanned repairs, and she said none were approved that week. He thanked her. Then he called the county dispatch non-emergency line for any recent incidents. The dispatcher hesitated, then said there had been a call, but the log was restricted. Tobin drove to the county building, and he signed a form to request older audio. He had done this before after crashes, so the clerk recognized his face and his patience. She printed a receipt, then she said the archive could take a few days to release files. Tobin did not argue, but he asked if the clerk could at least confirm the date. She leaned closer and whispered a date, then wrote it on a sticky note for him. It was from the previous weekend, which made no sense for a bridge with no visible damage. Tobin left with a bad feeling, and he drove straight to the nearest gas station by the river. An older man behind the counter watched Tobin's reflective vest and the camera on his seat. Tobin bought coffee, then asked if anyone had been working on the bridge recently. The man said no crews, but he said he heard sirens on Saturday night near the water. He added that 2 sheriff units blocked the south approach for almost an hour. Tobin asked why, and the man shrugged and said it looked like a training exercise. That word stuck because the sheriff department did not train on that bridge in winter. Tobin asked if anyone filmed it, and the man pointed at a small sign about security cameras. The gas station had a camera facing the road, but it only held footage for a short window. Tobin asked the manager, and she agreed to review the Saturday night clip with him. They stood in a back office, and the monitor showed a black SUV stopping near the bridge. Two vehicles arrived behind it, both unmarked, and their lights flashed once, then went dark. A man in a hood walked toward the bridge with something long, carried like a pipe. Another person dragged a heavy bag, and it sagged like it held wet sand. The footage was grainy, but the timing matched the sticky note date from the clerk. Tobin asked the manager to save the clip, and she said she could export it to a drive. He gave her a fresh one from his glove box. Then he wrote his phone number on tape. As he left, a woman pumping gas stared at him. Then she looked away too fast. Tobin approached her carefully, and he asked if she lived nearby or crossed the bridge often. She said she used to, but she stopped after hearing a strange sound at night. Tobin asked what sound, and she said it was a deep thump, followed by a light ringing. She added that the river carried sound, and it felt like it came from under the deck. Tobin returned to the bridge at dusk, and he parked where he could see the underside. The water was low, and the concrete pier bases were exposed in muddy brown light. He climbed down the bank, and he aimed a flashlight at the beams under the patch area. Most of the steel looked old but stable, with layers of paint and rust as expected. Then he saw a newer metal plate bolted over a joint, and the bolts looked mismatched. One bolt head was bright, like it had been installed recently with a different supplier. Tobin photographed it, then he ran his finger along the plate edge and felt fresh sealant. He called his supervisor, but the call went to voicemail, and Tobin left a short message. He said the bridge had an undocumented patch, plus new hardware that did not match inventory. He asked for a second inspector the next morning, then he returned to his truck to write. While he wrote, headlights approached, then stopped behind him without passing. Tobin looked in his mirror, and a dark pickup sat there with its engine idling. The driver did not honk and did not pull around, just waited like a patient shadow. Tobin started his truck, and the pickup backed up, then turned away toward town. That night, Tobin went home and opened his laptop to organize the day's files. He labeled each photo with timestamps, and he wrote a summary for the district server. Before sending it, he listened to his voicemail, and there was a new message from a blocked number. A man's voice said, "Stop looking at that bridge." Then the call ended with a click. Tobin saved the voicemail, then he forwarded it to his work email for documentation. He barely slept because the warning felt personal, and it arrived too soon to be random. The next morning, Tobin went to the archive office the clerk had mentioned. He signed another form, and after a long wait, a technician handed him a file on a disk. The technician said some parts were redacted, but the main dispatch portion was intact. Tobin drove to a quiet parking lot, and he played the audio through his car speakers. At first, it sounded normal, with a caller reporting a stalled vehicle near the bridge approach. Then, a second voice cut in, low and hurried, asking for units to switch channels. A few seconds later, someone said, "Keep traffic moving. Nobody stops on that deck." The audio did not name a suspect, but it contained a phrase Tobin could not ignore. The dispatcher said, "Do not notify fire," which was the opposite of standard procedure. Then a deputy said, "We need the portable welder," and the dispatcher repeated the request. A portable welder was not part of a normal traffic stop, and it was not road district gear. The last clear line was a deputy saying, "Bag is in the river," followed by static. Tobin sat still, and he replayed that line 3 times, trying to hear it differently. He could not, and the words made his stomach tighten like a fist. Tobin drove back to the bridge with a plan, and he brought a magnet, chalk, and a tape measure. He marked the plate position under the deck, then he measured the bolt spacing carefully. The pattern did not match any approved retrofit kit, and the plate covered something important. Near one edge, he saw a thin scorch mark on the beam, like heat had touched bare steel. Tobin scraped gently with a screwdriver, and a small flake lifted, showing fresher metal beneath. He photographed that too, then he stepped back and noticed a cable tie dangling near the joint. It was new plastic, cut clean, and it did not belong on a bridge built decades ago. A fisherman on the bank watched Tobin work and finally walked closer with cautious steps. He said he had seen men on the bridge at night, and they did not look like road workers. Tobin asked what they did, and the fisherman said they carried lights and a heavy toolbox. He added that they tossed something into the river, then one of them sprayed paint on the deck. Tobin asked what color, and the fisherman said it looked like quick black paint, not road tar. Tobin thanked him, then asked if he had a phone video, and the fisherman shook his head. He said his phone was old, and he did not want trouble with law enforcement. Tobin went to a marine supply shop and rented a small inspection camera on a flexible pole. The clerk showed him how to record, and Tobin paid in cash and kept the receipt. He returned to the bridge in late afternoon, when traffic was light and the light was steady. From the pier access point, he guided the camera toward the underside seam near the plate. The screen showed bolts, then shadows, then a narrow gap where the plate did not seal fully. Inside the gap, something pale reflected. Then the image sharpened into a strip of cloth. It was caught on metal like a snag, and it moved slightly in the river breeze. Tobin pulled the camera back, and he stared at the screen until his eyes burned. Cloth did not explain the weld request, and it did not explain the warning board either. He called a friend who worked in a neighboring county as a structural engineer named Lenora Vance. Lenora was 41, and she consulted on bridge retrofits and failure investigations. Tobin explained the plate, the mismatched bolts, and the dispatch audio without exaggeration. Lenora listened, then said the patch sounded like it covered a cut, not a simple surface repair. She said if someone cut a flange, they might bolt a plate to hide it, but the strength would change. Lenora met Tobin at a diner, and they reviewed photos on Tobin's laptop over cold fries. She pointed at the scorch mark and the tie, then she said someone had worked fast. Tobin played the voicemail, and Lenora's face tightened when she heard the warning. She asked if Tobin had shared the files, and Tobin said he had not sent them yet. Lenora told him to make 2 copies, one for his supervisor and one for a state office. She said local departments sometimes protected their own, even when the truth was ugly. Tobin did not want to believe that, but the audio line about fire still echoed in his head. That evening, Tobin drove to his office and copied everything onto 2 labeled drives. He placed one in a sealed envelope for his supervisor, then he held the second for himself. As he walked to his truck, he noticed the dark pickup again, parked across the lot. The driver did not get out, but the headlights blinked, then went steady like a signal. Tobin got in, locked the doors, and drove the long way home through a busier highway. He did not see the pickup follow, but he felt watched anyway, like the air had eyes. The next day, Tobin's supervisor called him in, and the conversation went strangely flat. The supervisor said the bridge was fine, and the patch was approved through a sheriff request. Tobin asked for the paperwork, and the supervisor said it was classified for public safety. Tobin said bridges did not get classified repairs, and the supervisor told him to drop it. When Tobin pushed back, the supervisor said Tobin could take leave until the next quarter. It was not a threat on paper, but it sounded like a door closing with a soft click. Tobin left the office, and he drove straight to the state transportation field office downtown. At the state office, Tobin met an intake officer who asked careful questions and took notes. Tobin gave the second drive, and he described the plate, the audio, and the gas station footage. The officer did not promise outcomes, but he said a bridge security review team would look. 2 days later, a state crew arrived at the Latham span with proper trucks and clear markings. Traffic stopped, and inspectors crawled under the deck with bright lights and measuring tools. By afternoon, the state posted a closure notice, and the bridge was shut until further notice. Locals complained, but the closure did not feel like overreaction to Tobin, it felt overdue. A week later, the state report came back with careful language, and it avoided direct blame. It said a critical member had been altered, and a temporary plate hid the modification. It said the alteration reduced safety margins, especially under heavy load and temperature shifts. Tobin asked the state officer what alteration meant, and the officer said someone cut the steel. The officer added that the cut looked deliberate, not corrosion, and tool marks were visible. Tobin thought about the portable welder request and the line about the bag in the river. He realized the bridge had not been repaired to protect drivers. It had been altered to hide something. The twist came from the marine camera clip, which the state team enhanced frame by frame. The pale cloth was not random. It was part of a high-visibility vest, torn on sharp steel. Under the vest, the camera caught a small badge tab, the kind used on county-issued uniforms. That explained the redacted dispatch log, and it explained the order not to notify fire crews. Someone had gone over the rail that night, and the people in charge tried to erase it. They cut steel to remove a mounted camera bracket, then patched and plated to cover the scars. The bag in the river, according to a later witness statement, held the broken camera and the bracket. The state never released the full identity of the person who fell, at least not publicly. Rumors spread anyway, and each version made the town quieter, more suspicious, and more tired. A deputy resigned, then another transferred, and the sheriff faced questions at tense meetings. Tobin kept his head down, but he kept copies of everything in a safe at his brother's house. Months later, a new bridge project was approved, and the old span stayed closed behind fences. People still drove out to look at it, like a scar they could not stop touching. They called it the bridge that changed everything, because after that, nobody trusted easy answers. Tobin stayed in the district, but he stopped believing that paperwork was the whole truth. He learned that structures fail, but so do institutions, and sometimes the cover-up is the real collapse. On certain nights, when wind moved through the river corridor, the old truss still hummed softly. Drivers crossing the new bridge sped up without meaning to, as if the road remembered fear. The Latham span did not just close a route, it opened a question nobody could fully close. It left a town with a new map and an older silence that sat under every conversation. The stories. Night guard, who vanished, reported years later. The missing persons file went cold in a week, then came back to life 7 years later with a single phone call. An archived dispatch note shows the same name logged twice, separated by almost a decade. In late November of 2012, Hollis Crane was 39 and worked nights as a security guard. He was contracted to watch a small warehouse complex on the edge of a mid-sized river city. The job was simple on paper, and it paid better than most overnight shifts in town. Hollis took it because his daughter needed braces, and overtime was suddenly available. The complex had 3 buildings, a fenced lot, and a guard shack near the gate. Hollis drove an older sedan with a cracked dash, and he kept a thermos on the passenger seat. His supervisor gave him a key ring, a radio, and a thin binder labeled Post Orders. The binder included map pages, emergency numbers, and a checklist of hourly patrol points. On his first week, Hollis learned the place had quirks that were not in the binder. One floodlight on the west fence flickered at random, even after an electrician replaced it. A back door on Building 2 stuck and needed a shoulder bump to close fully. Most nights, the river fog rolled in and made the camera feed look like smudged glass. Hollis logged each issue like he was trained, then kept doing his rounds. The last night anyone saw him was a Monday, and the weather report said clear skies. He clocked in at 10, signed the logbook, and checked the camera monitor in the shack. A delivery truck had left earlier, and the lot was quiet except for distant freeway noise. At 10:30, he called his supervisor to confirm a gate code change, and the call lasted 20 seconds. At 11:15, one of the building motion sensors tripped and sent an alert to the shack. The system was old, and false alarms were common, but Hollis still did the routine response. He grabbed a flashlight, a heavy jacket, and his radio, then walked toward Building 2. The camera view showed his figure crossing the lot, and then the image pixelated for a moment. That was the last clear footage that stayed on record. The cameras kept running, but the angle on the back corridor went to static for 6 minutes. When it came back, the corridor was empty, and the back door stood slightly open. The door should have swung shut on its own, and it usually did, even when it stuck. At midnight, Hollis missed a scheduled radio check with the contracted dispatch service. The dispatcher called the shack phone, and it rang without an answer. A second call went the same way. Then the dispatcher phoned the city police non-emergency line. The responding patrol officer found the gate locked and the shack lights on. Inside the shack, Hollis's thermos sat open, and the coffee had gone cold. The logbook lay on the counter, with the last entry half finished and the pen uncapped. His jacket was missing, along with the keyring and the handheld radio. The officer wrote in his report that the chair was pushed back hard, like someone stood up fast. No signs of a struggle were obvious, but the place felt abandoned in a hurry. Officers searched the lot with flashlights and called Hollis's name, getting only echo and river wind. They found his boot prints leading toward Building 2, then fading where gravel turned to packed dirt. Near the back door, they found a small smear of dark grease on the handle. It looked like maintenance grime, but it was fresh, and it did not match the door's usual dirt pattern. A canine unit arrived later and traced a scent line to the west fence, then lost it near the riverbank. The first assumption was that Hollis wandered off, got hurt, or decided to disappear. His family did not buy that, and neither did the detective who took the case. Hollis had recently renewed his lease, and he had a dentist appointment set for that week. His bank account showed normal spending, and his phone did not ping far from the complex. Still, the river was close, and the area had blind spots where cameras did not reach. The investigation moved step by step, like most missing adult cases with limited evidence. Detectives pulled the camera recordings and noted the 6-minute static block in the corridor feed. They collected the shack logbook and photographed the chair position and the open thermos. They interviewed the electrician about the flickering light and learned it had shorted before. They also looked at maintenance records and saw Building 2 had a door latch repaired twice that year. A week later, the file went quiet, and it stayed quiet for years. The security company quietly replaced the cameras and installed a new sensor system. The complex changed tenants, and the guard shack got a new coat of paint. Hollis's family kept his missing poster up at grocery stores, then slowly took them down. The detective rotated out of the unit, and the case became a box in a storage room. In the spring of 2020, a new detective named Price Calder took over cold cases. Price was 44 and worked as a violent crimes detective before shifting to unsolved files. He picked Hollis's case because the original reports were oddly clean, with too few conclusions. The file included a single line that stuck out, a note about the corridor camera going to static. Price asked for the raw footage, and the evidence technician said it still existed on an old drive. The first viewing was disappointing, because the static looked like a simple signal drop. Then Price slowed it down and watched the edges of the frame. Right before the static, a bright band rolled across the screen like a manual interruption. It looked less like weather interference and more like someone unplugged then reconnected a component. Price compared that with the other cameras, looking for any matching drop at the same time. The west fence camera did not glitch at all, and the shack camera stayed steady. That meant the corridor feed failed alone, not as part of a system-wide outage. Price wrote that down, then called a retired technician who had installed the system. The technician reportedly said that specific camera line ran through an exposed junction box near the west fence. Price drove out to the complex with a city inspector and asked to see the old junction route. The box had been replaced years earlier, but the mounting holes in the post were still visible. A new conduit ran cleaner, yet an older cable path had been left in place behind a utility shed. It led toward the riverbank, and the inspector said it was common to abandon runs like that. Price photographed the path and asked the current property manager about any past trespassing issues. The manager mentioned a story, and it sounded like gossip until Price pressed for details. Years back, a fisherman claimed he found a radio near the river, then lost it to police. No report existed for that recovery, at least not under Hollis's name. Price asked the manager to locate the fisherman, and the manager gave a first name and a phone number. 2 days later, Price reached the fisherman and heard a nervous pause before any answer. The fisherman said he had found a handheld radio in Reeds sometime in early December of 2012. He claimed he called the number on it, and a man answered and told him to leave it alone. That part sounded strange, because those radios did not have call numbers like cell phones. When Price asked more, the fisherman admitted he never actually called. He just showed it to someone. He said a man in a pickup offered cash for it, and he took the cash, then regretted it later. Price did not treat that as a confession, but it was a new lead that fit the junction box detail. He requested old traffic camera logs for that stretch of access road near the complex. Most footage was gone, but a few still images remained for toll and speed enforcement. One image from that week showed a pickup parked near the west fence access lane. The plate was too blurred to read, yet the truck had a distinctive ladder rack. Price checked old maintenance work orders and found a contractor had serviced floodlights that month. The contractor's truck in the paperwork had a ladder rack. The name on the invoice was a small electrical firm that had since dissolved. Price ran the owner's name and found it tied to another investigation from years earlier. It involved theft from job sites and a pattern of selling company gear for cash. Price pulled the old interview with the electrician who replaced the flickering floodlight. That electrician had said the light shorted before, and he had replaced the head twice. Price asked a modern technician to inspect the current light circuit. They found evidence of repeated tampering in the conduit, with tool marks under the protective sleeve. It was not proof of a crime, but it suggested someone had been inside that line more than once. The case stayed frustrating until a different phone call landed on Price's desk. In late September of 2020, a hospital social worker called the police tip line. She said an older man had checked in, confused and dehydrated, and he kept repeating a name. The name was Hollis Crane, and the man insisted he was Hollis, despite missing teeth and heavy weight loss. The hospital could not confirm identity, but his fingerprints were taken as part of intake. Those prints matched the missing file, and the match was confirmed by a state lab technician. Price drove to the hospital and met the man in a quiet room with a nurse present. Hollis looked older than his age, and his hands trembled when he lifted a cup. He recognized his own name, but he struggled with dates and places. When Price asked about the warehouse, Hollis stared at the wall and said, "They said I was wrong." He then asked if his daughter was still in middle school, which made the nurse look down. Over several interviews, Hollis gave fragments that Price treated as witness statements, not perfect memory. He recalled walking to Building 2, then hearing his radio crackle with a voice he did not recognize. He said the voice told him the back door was open and that he needed to check inside. That instruction did not match the dispatch service, which never gave site-specific commands. Hollis said he stepped into the corridor and someone behind him shut the door hard. He remembered a bright light in his face and a chemical smell that made his throat burn. Then he remembered being in a vehicle, hearing river water, and feeling cold air through a broken window. After that, his memories became like short clips with missing sound. He remembered being told his name was different and that he had been caught stealing. He remembered paperwork on a table and a hand guiding his fingers to sign. Hollis said he refused, and the hand slapped him, then the room went dark again. Price did not accept every piece as literal, but the pattern sounded like coercion and control. The hospital ran toxicology, and traces suggested long-term exposure to sedatives, though not definitive. A doctor noted possible head trauma and suggested his memory could be fragmented by repeated injury. Price asked Hollis about the ladder rack truck, and Hollis flinched before answering. He said he remembered a metal clang, like a ladder shifting, and a voice that whistled on certain words. Price compared that with old recordings, including the dispatch call placed by Hollis at 10:30. The call was short, but Hollis's voice had a distinct cadence, with a slight nasal edge. The voice on the missed radio check recordings was not preserved, but the dispatch service kept notes. One note said a male voice answered the shack phone once, then hung up without speaking. That had been written off as a wrong number, but Price now treated it as a signal. Price worked backward from the corridor camera static and the junction box location. He believed someone cut the camera line briefly, then used the blind spot to move Hollis. The west fence led toward the river path where the fisherman found a radio. That radio was likely dropped or tossed during the move, then bought back by someone who wanted it gone. The ladder rack truck tied the event to a contractor with access and a reason to be there. The payoff came from something small, a property tax photo archived by the county. It showed the utility shed behind the lodge-like building, taken in 2013 for assessment. In the background, the old junction post was visible, and a cable loop hung lower than code required. Price enlarged the image and saw a strip of tape around the cable, the same bright pattern used by that contractor. The tape brand was common, but the pattern matched other job site photos in an unrelated theft file. Price located a former employee of the dissolved firm, and the man agreed to talk with legal counsel present. He said his boss used to brag about teaching people a lesson when they got in his way. He also said the boss kept a storage unit where he hid tools, radios, and uniforms from past jobs. A search warrant was requested based on the totality of evidence, and a judge signed it. In the unit, officers found old security shirts, a handheld radio shell, and a binder of fake ID templates. No single item proved the full story, but together they supported a clear, plausible chain. Hollis was likely taken during that 6-minute blind spot, moved along the west fence, and forced into a vehicle. He was kept under control, pushed into a false identity, and moved between transient locations for years. He resurfaced only after his health failed, and he wandered into a hospital without resources or support. The suspect was arrested on charges related to kidnapping and identity fraud, according to later court filings. Hollis's reunion with his family did not look like a movie ending, and witnesses described it as quiet. His daughter was an adult, and she approached him slowly, like he might vanish if touched. Hollis cried when he heard her voice, and he kept saying he was sorry, even when no apology was owed. Price watched from the doorway, thinking about how a tiny camera glitch hid a life for years. Some cases do not end with certainty, but this one ended with a name returned home. The stories. Paramedic who broke protocol after the storm. The run sheet said the call never happened, but 3 witnesses remembered the ambulance anyway. The medic who signed it broke protocol, and the storm was only part of the reason. In early September of 2019, Reeve Donlin was 39 and worked as a paramedic for a county EMS service. He lived in a small river town in the Midwest, where storms tore up trees and power lines every summer. That morning, the remnants of a hurricane had drifted inland, dumping rain hard for hours. By noon, the river spilled into streets, and the dispatch center started stacking calls like plates. Reeve showed up for a 12-hour shift with dry socks, extra gloves, and a calm face. His partner, Talia Mendez, was 27 and a brand new EMT who still checked everything twice. They stocked the truck, ran their radio check, and waited in the bay with doors open. The supervisor told crews to stage on high ground and avoid floodwater. No exceptions today. Reeve nodded like always, but his eyes stayed on the weather map taped to the wall. He had worked enough storms to know the map never showed the small disasters. Their first calls were simple: a fall in a dark stairwell, a diabetic who ran out of insulin. They moved slow because debris made every street feel like a maze. Around 4:30, the radio crackled with a priority tone that made Talia sit up straight. Dispatch gave an address near the river, then stopped and corrected it to a cross street. The dispatcher's voice sounded tight, like she had been arguing with someone off mic. The notes said, "Possible trapped person, caller unsure, water rising." The supervisor came on next and repeated the standing order about not entering flood zones. Reeve keyed up and asked if fire was en route for water rescue support. The supervisor said resources were thin and crews should not self-deploy into danger. Reeve acknowledged, then stared at the tablet, reading the caller number and name. The caller name matched someone Reeve recognized from a prior overdose call, a man named Kester Vale. Kester lived in a rental house near the river with a porch that sagged like a tired jaw. Reeve remembered Kester as loud, scared, and protective of his younger sister. That sister, Mrballen Vale, had asthma and a heart condition, according to old chart notes. Reeve also remembered the last crew found their smoke detectors missing. Talia asked if they should stage at the edge and wait for fire, like they were told. Reeve said yes, but he turned the wheel toward the river anyway, taking the shortest route. They stopped where the pavement dipped into brown water and the barricade floated sideways. A neighbor waved both arms from a driveway, yelling something that the rain swallowed. Reeve got out, boots sinking in mud, and asked where the caller was. The neighbor pointed at the Vale house, and the porch light blinked like a weak heartbeat. Water covered the front steps, and the yard looked like a shallow lake. Kester stood at a window, banging on the glass with his palm, face pale and furious. Reeve walked closer until the water reached his knees, then stopped and assessed. He could see Mrballen inside, sitting on the couch, shoulders hunched, breathing fast. Talia stayed by the truck, scanning for drifting debris and watching the water level. Reeve called fire dispatch on the radio and asked again for a rescue team. The dispatcher said units were tied up and an estimated arrival time was unknown. Kester slammed the window again and shouted, "She can't breathe! She's turning gray!" Reeve looked at Mrballen's lips, and even through glass, he saw a bluish tint. Protocol said, "Wait, do not enter moving water, do not compromise the crew for one patient." Reeve knew the rule, and he had repeated it to rookies a dozen times. He also knew asthma did not politely pause while resources got sorted. He called his supervisor and described what he saw, then asked for permission to enter. The supervisor said no and added that any entry would be considered a direct violation. Reeve ended the call and took one more look at Mrballen's posture and the panic in her eyes. He told Talia to keep the truck in place and to call for law and fire again. Talia asked if he was serious, and Reeve said, "Stay dry and keep eyes on me." Then he waded forward, one step at a time, feeling the push of water on his thighs. He reached the porch rail, grabbed it, and pulled himself to the door. Kester opened it fast, and the smell inside hit like wet carpet and old cigarettes. Reeve told Kester to move back, then stepped into ankle-deep water on the living room floor. Marlon tried to speak, but her words came out broken and thin. Reeve knelt beside her, checked her pulse, and listened to her lungs. The wheeze was tight, and her oxygen level on the finger clip was dropping fast. He reached for his kit and realized the bag was still with Talia at the truck. Reeve swore under his breath and asked Kester if they had any inhalers. Kester ran to a kitchen drawer and returned with a rescue inhaler with a cracked cap. Reeve checked the label and saw it was expired, but it was better than nothing. He coached Marlon through 2 puffs, then watched her chest keep fighting. Her breathing did not ease, and her hands started to tremble in a way Reeve did not like. He needed a nebulizer treatment and oxygen, and he needed it now. He asked Kester where the nearest high spot was, and Kester pointed toward a back window. Behind the house, the ground rose slightly, but the walkway was narrow and clogged with branches. Reeve decided to move Marlon out, even if it meant carrying her through water. He called to Talia through the open door, and his voice sounded small in the rain. Talia ran closer with the jump bag and the oxygen kit held over her head. She stopped at the waterline and looked at Reeve like she wanted to argue. Reeve told her to stay at the edge and hand him what he asked for. Talia slid the oxygen tubing and mask across the porch rail like a lifeline. Reeve put the mask on Marlon, opened the valve, and watched her shoulders loosen slightly. He set up the nebulizer with albuterol, hands steady even as water bumped his knees. Marlon's eyes stayed locked on him, desperate and trusting in a way that felt heavy. Kester hovered close, asking if she was dying, and Reeve told him to help by staying quiet. The treatment ran, and the wheeze softened, but it did not clear the way Reeve expected. That was when Reeve noticed bruising on Marlon's neck, faint fingerprints under damp hair. He did not react outwardly, but his mind filed it away with a cold click. He asked Marlon what happened before the breathing got bad, and she glanced at Kester first. Marlon said, "I slipped," then looked down, then added, "I fell in the hallway." Reeve asked where, and Marlon pointed toward a door that led to the back room. Reeve told Kester to keep holding the oxygen, then moved toward the back room carefully. He opened the door and saw a mattress on the floor, a space heater, and a chain lock on the inside. The chain lock was mounted high, like it was meant to keep someone in, not keep someone out. There was also a phone on the mattress with a cracked screen, and it was powered off. Reeve stood still, hearing the rain outside, and felt the call shift in his gut. He returned to Marlon and asked if she had called 911 herself. Marlon shook her head, then nodded, then said, "I tried, but it wouldn't work." Kester cut in and said the cell towers were down, and that was why he called from a neighbor. Reeve asked the neighbor's name, and Kester hesitated before answering. Talia caught that hesitation, and her eyes flicked to Reeve with a silent question. Marlon's breathing improved enough to move, so Reeve chose the back window exit. He and Kester carried her together, Reeve supporting her shoulders and Kester lifting her legs. They stepped into water again, pushing through branches, and Reeve kept talking to Marlon steadily. Talia followed along the higher edge, keeping oxygen flowing, watching for slips. They reached the small rise behind the house, where the mud was thick but not submerged. Reeve radioed that they had a patient and needed a clear route to transport. The supervisor replied with a clipped tone, asking why the crew entered the flood zone. Reeve said, "Patient was failing, no rescue resources available," and kept his voice controlled. The supervisor told them to return to staging and wait for fire to assist extraction. Reeve looked at Marlon, saw her lips still tinted, and decided he was done waiting. He loaded Marlon onto the stretcher on the high ground, then angled it toward a neighbor's driveway. The driveway sloped upward to dry pavement, and it was passable if they moved fast. They rolled the stretcher, wheels bouncing, while Kester ran ahead, clearing branches. Talia stayed near the head of the stretcher, keeping the mask sealed, face tense and focused. They got Marlon into the ambulance and started toward the hospital without lights to avoid debris panic. On the way, Reeve documented everything out loud so the dash audio captured it. He said arrival time, patient condition, oxygen levels, treatment given, and response observed. He also said, noted bruising on neck, pattern consistent with grip, keeping the tone neutral. Talia stared at him, surprised, then looked back to Marlon, who had drifted into shallow sleep. Reeve called the receiving hospital and gave a report, including the bruising and the locked room. At the hospital, staff moved Marlon into a bay, placed monitors, and started additional breathing support. A nurse asked Kester to wait outside, and Kester argued until security stepped in. Reeve watched Kester's eyes, calculating and angry, then watched him step back too quickly. Talia whispered, "That didn't feel right," and Reeve nodded without looking at her. He finished the electronic chart, then paused at the signature line. Protocol violation meant the chart would draw attention, and attention meant questions about the house. Reeve had a choice, and he made it in a quiet, uncomfortable way. He entered the call as a different location, the dry driveway, not the flooded home. He left out the chain lock detail, and he described the bruising as possible injury from fall. Talia saw the entries and asked why he was softening it, and Reeve said, "Trust me for now." Back at the station, the supervisor called Reeve into an office and shut the door. He said the crew had endangered themselves and the truck, and the county could face liability. Reeve did not argue about the water, because the facts were the facts. He said the patient would have died if they waited, and he meant it. The supervisor said the run sheet looked clean enough, then asked who told Reeve about the address. That question landed wrong, like the supervisor cared more about blame than care. Reeve said dispatch gave it, and the supervisor said dispatch records were being audited. He warned Reeve not to freelance during a declared emergency, then dismissed him with a cold stare. Outside, Talia waited, and she asked if they were fired. Reeve told her no, but he said they needed to keep their own notes. Reeve went home and opened a notebook he kept for odd calls, writing the timeline carefully. He wrote the door chain detail, the powered-off phone, and Kester's hesitation about the neighbor. He also wrote that the supervisor seemed too eager for the chart to look tidy. The next day, he called an old friend who worked in hospital administration off the record. The friend said Marlon was stable, but she asked to speak to someone without family present. That was when the story cracked open into something larger than a storm call. According to a nurse statement later filed, Marlon said Kester had been keeping her inside. She reportedly said he took her phone, locked the back room, and used fear to control her. She also reportedly said the storm was his excuse because no one would come quickly. The nurse called social services, and law enforcement opened a separate inquiry. Reeve's run sheet, however, did not match the nurse timeline, and that mismatch mattered. A week later, Internal Affairs pulled radio traffic, dispatch logs, and the ambulance GPS history. They noticed the truck entered a restricted flood zone and stayed there for 17 minutes. The supervisor claimed he was never told the patient was in distress, which contradicted the recorded call. Reeve requested the audio, and when he heard it, he caught something that made his jaw tighten. There was a gap in the supervisor's radio response, like a clipped section, not just static. Reeve asked dispatch for the raw recording, not the stitched file used for review. A dispatcher named Cora Helvey met him at a coffee shop, careful and nervous. She said she was not supposed to share anything, but she hated what was happening. Cora said the supervisor had direct access to the recording system during emergencies. She also said he sometimes cleaned up audio when crews got complaints. Reeve did not record Cora, but he wrote down what she said, time and date included. He then requested a public records copy through the county clerk, using the proper process. The response came back with a note that certain files were exempt due to personnel review. That answer did not deny the files existed, and it did not confirm they were intact. Reeve kept pushing, not loudly, but steadily, the way he handled stubborn insurance forms. Meanwhile, detectives interviewed the neighbor who owned the driveway where Marlon was loaded. The neighbor confirmed Kester ran to his house and demanded to use his phone. He also said Kester was already soaked, like he had been in the water before calling. The neighbor said he heard shouting inside the Vale house earlier, before the worst rain. Those details showed up in witness statements, and they lined up with what Reeve suspected. The twist came from something small, and it came from Talia's attention to details. She remembered the cracked inhaler Kester handed over, and she remembered the pharmacy label. The label had Marlon's name, but it had a refill date from 2 months earlier. That meant Marlon had not been cut off from care, at least not entirely. It also meant someone was controlling her access in a way that looked normal on paper. Talia visited the pharmacy after her shift and spoke to a technician she knew from school. The technician said Kester picked up Marlon's meds most months, and he signed for them himself. He also asked for her records once, claiming insurance problems after a storm claim denial. That detail sounded like nothing, until Reeve connected it to his own job history. Reeve had inspected a roof on Kester Street the previous year and denied part of a claim. Reeve pulled his old claim notes and found a photo of the Vale house from that earlier visit. In the photo, the back window had bars that were not in the neighborhood norm. The report also mentioned smoke detectors missing, which could be another control tactic. Reeve realized Kester might have recognized him, then used the storm chaos to create leverage. The flood zone was not just danger, it was cover for a staged crisis. Reeve brought that information to detectives, along with his notebook and the official run sheet. He admitted he altered the chart, and he explained why he thought it mattered for safety. He said he feared the supervisor would bury the locked room detail, and he was partly right. Detectives requested the ambulance dash audio, and the unedited file included his spoken notes. That audio captured the bruising observation clearly, and it matched the timestamps. When the county finally released the raw radio file under legal pressure, the gap was obvious. Experts later said it looked like a manual edit, not a transmission drop. The supervisor was placed on leave, then later resigned before a formal hearing concluded. No one publicly called it a cover-up, but the paperwork language was careful and pointed. Reeve was disciplined for the protocol breach, but he kept his license after review. Kester was charged in a separate case, based on Mrballen's statements and corroborating evidence. The storm did not cause the bruises, and it did not install a chain lock on a bedroom. Reeve's choice to enter the water was still a violation, and he accepted that fact. But his larger break from protocol was quieter, the choice to keep notes beyond the system. Those notes helped unwind what the storm tried to hide. Months later, Reeve returned to that same river road on a dry afternoon. The Vale house looked smaller in daylight, and the porch rail had been replaced. Reeve did not go up to the door, and he did not need to. He sat in his truck for a minute, then drove away, thinking about rules and reality. In the end, the storm was loud, but the real danger was the silence people edited in. The stories. These archived dispatch calls revealed proof. The audio sat in a plain folder, stamped with a date and a case number that never went anywhere. Years later, those archived dispatch calls finally showed what actually happened that night. Blaine Hargrove was 42. And he produced local radio stories for a small station in the Desert West. On a Monday morning in early spring, he drove to the county building to request old emergency recordings. He had a simple goal for the day. He wanted sound for a cautious piece about misfiled crash reports. The station had heard whispers for years. One incident near a highway turnout kept returning in complaints. The rumor was always the same: a late-night call, a single vehicle, then a sudden silence. Some locals said a teenager vanished. Others said the report was padded to hide a police mistake. Blaine never repeated those claims on air. He only said the file had gaps and missing pages. Dispatch archives were supposed to be routine, so he expected a quick copy and a polite goodbye. At the counter, a clerk named Lark Soria slid a form under the glass and kept her voice low. She looked about 30, and she worked records intake for public requests and internal routing. She told Blaine the recordings existed, but the index notes were strange and partly overwritten. Blaine asked what that meant, and she shrugged, like she did not want the answer either. Lark led him to a side desk with an old computer and a small speaker that crackled at low volume. She said the county had migrated systems twice, and some files survived only as stitched fragments. Blaine thanked her, then put on headphones and began listening with a producer's careful patience. The first minutes sounded normal, a dispatcher logging traffic stops and a stalled truck call. Then the incident started, with a man's voice cutting in, tense, short, and trying to stay calm. He said he was at a turnout by the mile marker sign and something was wrong with a parked car. The dispatcher asked for details, and the caller said the driver was slumped and not responding. Blaine expected the next line: send units, start medical, confirm location. But the recording shifted. A second dispatcher voice appeared, sharper, and it used a call sign Blaine did not recognize. It ordered a unit to break off, then told another unit to hold traffic and wait for a supervisor. The first dispatcher tried to speak, but the audio clipped like someone keyed a mic too close. Blaine rewound and listened again, and the same odd command landed in the same exact second. He paused the audio and stared at the screen. because it sounded like two channels merged poorly. Lark watched him from behind the counter, and her face tightened when she saw his expression. Blaine asked if the second dispatcher was real or if the system had a known echo problem. Lark said there should have been only one dispatcher on nights, and the roster showed a single name. Blaine kept listening, and the caller's voice returned, quieter now, as if he had moved closer. He said the car door was open, and there was a phone on the seat with the screen still lit. The dispatcher told him to step back, and he agreed, but his breathing stayed loud in the mic. Then a new sound came through, a brief metallic click, followed by a calm voice saying, "Cancel units." The cancel order did not sound like a field officer. It sounded like a desk voice with a practiced rhythm. Blaine felt his skin go cold because cancellations were supposed to include a reason and a unit number. Instead, the voice simply said the call was unfounded and told everyone to return to prior assignments. The original dispatcher protested, and the recording ended with a sharp tone and a cut to dead air. Blaine removed the headphones and asked Lark if the logbook matched what he had just heard. She opened a scanned report on her screen, and it showed a routine welfare check with no transport. The notes said the vehicle belonged to an out-of-town contractor, and it drove off before contact. Blaine asked if any unit ever arrived, and Lark said the unit number was blank in the entry. He requested the original dispatch log, and Lark told him those paper logs were stored off-site in boxes. She offered to file another request, and Blaine agreed, keeping his voice steady and professional. As he signed the form, he noticed her hands were trembling, like she had heard this story too. Lark said she could not access everything, but she could tell him where the boxes were indexed. That afternoon, Blaine returned to his station office and transferred the audio into editing software. He did not change the file, he only made a working copy and marked the timestamps carefully. He listened in full, then compared it to the written entry line by line, looking for simple explanations. A bad merge could explain overlap, but it could not explain the new dispatcher voice using a missing call sign. Blaine called a retired dispatcher he knew, a man named Hollis Gant, who taught radio basics at a community college. Hollis was 61, and he had worked nights for 2 decades before taking early retirement. Blaine played a short excerpt, and Hollis immediately asked where the second voice came from. He said it sounded like a console mic, not a portable radio, because of the clean compression and lack of wind noise. Blaine asked about the click, and Hollis said it sounded like a channel patch being opened and closed. He explained that old systems let supervisors override traffic, especially during officer safety incidents. Blaine asked if overrides were logged, and Hollis said they should be, unless someone bypassed the normal menu. He also said the voice cadence felt familiar, like someone who had trained others and used set phrases. Blaine made a plan that was simple: gather every source that could confirm who spoke and who listened. He requested the off-site paper logs, the unit assignment roster, and the maintenance notes for the dispatch console. He also tracked down the original caller, using the case number tied to the partial record index. The contact address was outdated, but a utility record pointed to a forwarding box in a coastal town. A week later, Blaine reached the caller by phone, and the man sounded older than expected. His name was Keir Lamb. He was 50, and he worked as a forklift mechanic for a shipping yard. Keir said he had avoided interviews for years because he felt stupid and scared about that night. He agreed to talk off the record first, as long as Blaine did not use his name on air. Keir said he had been driving home late, and he pulled into the turnout to make a quick call. He noticed a sedan with its driver door open and a person inside who did not respond. He called emergency services from a flip phone, and he remembered the dispatcher voice clearly. He also remembered someone else talking over her, like a second person in the same room. Keir said he heard the cancel order, and it did not come through the phone speaker. He said it came from behind him, like someone standing near the turnout speaking into a handheld radio. Blaine asked if Keir saw anyone, and Keir said he saw a dark SUV with no light bar. It rolled in slow, stopped without headlights, and someone stepped out and told him to leave. Keir said the person was not in uniform, but he held a radio and spoke like he belonged there. He told Keir, "Go home. You didn't see anything, and you don't want trouble." Keir left because he believed him, and because his phone screen had gone dark as if the call dropped. He drove straight home, and he did not sleep, because he kept imagining the open car door in the wind. Blaine asked why Keir never filed a complaint, and Keir said he tried once, then got warned again. He said a man called his house the next day and knew details that were not in the public record. The man told him the county had it handled and said his job could get complicated if he kept talking. Keir said he had a kid at home then, and he chose silence, even though it still bothered him. Blaine compared Keir's memory to the audio again, and one detail stood out in a new way. The cancel voice sounded like it came through the dispatch system, but Keir remembered hearing it nearby. That meant someone on scene repeated the cancel order, or someone on scene caused it to happen. Blaine needed more than a feeling. He needed a solid chain from the console to the turnout. When the offsite boxes arrived, Lark called Blaine and told him to come in after lunch. She met him with a cart of binders and a warning. The pages smelled like smoke and old tape. Blaine thanked her, then began photographing entries with his phone, keeping the dates aligned. The log for that night included the initial call, but the next lines were torn out cleanly. The tier was too neat for age, like someone removed a strip on purpose and then filed the rest. Blaine asked Lark who handled archives back then, and she said a supervisor managed retention compliance. She gave Blaine a name that was public in old payroll records, a dispatch supervisor known for strict control. Blaine did not repeat the name in his notes. He wrote only supervisor and the year. Blaine requested the maintenance notes next, hoping they would show a console override or a repair ticket. The county replied with a short letter saying no relevant notes existed due to a purge policy. Blaine appealed the response and included dates and system model references from public purchasing records. 2 days later, a different clerk emailed a scan that had been missed, a single page with a service code. The page referenced a patch panel fault, and it listed a time within minutes of the turnout call. It also listed a technician sign-off, and the signature matched the supervisor's initials in the payroll files. Blaine showed the page to Hollis, and Hollis frowned and said that was not a technician's signature. He said it looked like a supervisor signing to close a ticket without an actual repair. Blaine now had 3 things that aligned: an overwritten index, torn log lines, and an odd console patch record. Still, none of it proved who issued the cancel order, and none of it proved why. He needed the one thing most people ignored: the background noise that rides under speech. So he took the working copy and asked an audio engineer at the station to run a clean analysis. The engineer, a woman named Tamsin Rowe, was 35 and had built her career restoring old interview tape. She listened with good headphones, then zoomed into the waveform around the metallic click. She said there was a second click under the first, offset by a fraction of a second. She explained it sounded like a desk foot switch, followed by a handheld transmit button. Tamsin also noticed something stranger: a low tone under the cancel voice that stayed constant. She said it sounded like an air conditioner fan, the kind found in small office rooms. Then, she compared it to the first dispatcher voice, and the fan tone was different and steadier. That suggested the cancel voice was recorded in a different room, then patched into the main channel. Blaine asked if that could happen, and Tamsin said yes, if someone used a training room console. Some centers had a second console for drills, and it could be patched into live traffic in emergencies. Blaine asked who had access, and Tamsin said supervisors and trainers usually had the keys. Blaine felt the story tightening because a trainer would know exactly how to sound calm on a bad night. He returned to the county building and asked Lark one careful question: did the dispatch center have a training console then? Lark hesitated, then said the old floor plan showed a side room labeled instruction booth. She said it was removed during renovations, but it existed in that era and shared wiring with the main floor. Blaine asked if the booth had its own mic, and she said yes, and it had a direct patch switch. Blaine still did not have the motive, and he did not want to guess at it. So he looked at what else happened that night, and he found something buried in unrelated paperwork. A property sheet showed a large cash seizure from a traffic stop logged into the evidence room at midnight. The next morning, the cash was reported short, and the report blamed a counting error and got closed. Blaine lined up the times, and the turnout call landed right between the evidence log and the cash discrepancy report. He asked Hollis if a fake emergency could pull units off the road, and Hollis said it was a classic trick. A welfare check at a turnout would draw patrol, and it would also distract dispatch from monitoring internal doors. If someone needed 5 minutes alone, A sudden call and a sudden cancel could make that window. Blaine called Keir again and asked about the dark SUV, and Keir described it in more detail. He said it had a State Fleet plate and a small antenna cluster like a communications vehicle. He said the driver who spoke to him wore a plain jacket, but carried himself like a supervisor. Keir also said the sedan in the turnout was not in bad shape. It looked staged, like it had been parked carefully. Blaine realized the proof was not just in what the dispatch calls said, it was in what they avoided saying. No one ever confirmed a unit arrival, no one ever logged a plate check, and no one asked for medical priority. The call was designed to be started and stopped quickly, without the normal steps that create paper trails. That meant the person controlling it knew policy and knew exactly which parts to skip. Blaine requested one more thing: the building entry logs for the dispatch center on that night. The county said those logs did not exist anymore, but a facilities contractor had kept backups for billing disputes. After more calls, Blaine obtained a scanned badge report that showed door activity after midnight. It showed the supervisor badge opening the training booth door, then the evidence room hallway door minutes later. Blaine sat with Tamsin and Hollis and listened to the key moments again, with the badge report in hand. They played the click, the cancel voice, and the sharp cut to dead air. Hollis said the cut sounded like a manual stop, not a system end, because the tail tone was missing. Tamsin said the handheld click matched a portable radio nearby, which fit Keir hearing a voice behind him. Blaine had to be careful, because proof can still be misunderstood if the story gets rushed. He wrote a timeline using only documents, audio artifacts, and witness statements that could be verified. He removed names, and he removed any detail that could point to private people who had done nothing wrong. He focused on the method: a staged call, a training booth patch, a rapid cancel, and a missing log strip. When Blaine returned to the county building to ask for comment, Lark met him with tired eyes. She said someone had called her office, asking why she kept helping a radio producer dig up old dirt. Blaine told her she did not need to do anything else, and he could handle the rest on his own. Lark shook her head and said she had one more thing, because she was done pretending it was normal. She handed him a photocopy of an internal memo, filed as a training note but written like a warning. It instructed staff to route certain audio requests to supervision, and it referenced the turnout call by date. The memo used the phrase proof risk, and it ordered that no copies be made outside official review. Lark said she found it in a misfiled binder, and it had never been scanned into the public index. Blaine read the memo twice, then folded it and placed it in a plain envelope with his notes. The proof was not a confession, but it was a paper trail showing someone feared what the audio contained. He thanked Lark, and she asked one question: "Are you going to put this out there?" Blaine said he would, but he would do it carefully and only with what he could support. The final piece came from a place Blaine did not expect: a voicemail from an old number he had called weeks earlier. It was short and strained, and it sounded like a person trying to choose words that would not invite retaliation. The voice said the training booth patch switch was used that night, and it was used by someone with keys. The voice also said the sedan at the turnout belonged to a county pool, and it was checked out under a fake entry. Blaine saved the voicemail, then asked Tamsin to confirm it was not spliced or altered. Tamsin said it was clean, and she noted the same steady fan tone found under the cancel voice. That meant the voicemail speaker had likely been in the same small room and knew the sound of it. Blaine did not know who left the message, but the audio carried its own quiet fingerprint. When the story aired, Blaine kept the language careful and grounded because facts matter more than heat. He played the dispatch excerpt, then explained the torn log, the badge report, and the patch record. He included Keir's account without naming him, and he described the SUV in broad terms only. He never claimed a specific person stole anything, but he showed how the staged call created a perfect distraction. The county responded with a short statement, saying the matter was old and could not be confirmed. They did not deny the training booth existed, and they did not explain why the log strip was missing. Within days, a state auditor announced a review of evidence handling practices going back many years. Blaine did not celebrate, because the point was never drama. It was the shape of truth in the record. Weeks later, Blaine sat in his edit room and listened to the archived call one last time. He noticed how the original dispatcher sounded, like someone trying to do her job inside a sudden fog. He imagined the moment she realized a second voice had taken control, and she could not stop it. It was not supernatural. It was ordinary power, used quietly, and that made it worse. Blaine filed the raw audio, the memo copy, and his notes into the station archive with strict access rules. He labeled everything with dates in words, so future staff would not lose the trail in bad metadata. He also sent Keir a short message through the number he had, saying the story was finally out. Keir replied once, and only with relief, saying he could breathe easier now. The proof had been there all along, hiding in a click, a fan hum, and a missing strip of paper. It did not solve every question about the turnout, but it showed the call was never what it claimed. For Blaine, that was enough to matter, because it meant the record could still be corrected. And for anyone who still trusted the archive, it was a reminder that silence sometimes has fingerprints.